All right. Should we get started? Looks like we just have one item on the agenda, which I put. If anyone else wants to chat about something, feel free to put it on so that I don't go on to talk for an hour and miss it.
Just before we do that, John, just on the still in review items, I think the first two have been sitting there for probably 9 months and are now effectively part of the beta and are approved. So I'm just going to remove them. Lynn, do you need any more commentary on your annotations and labels in Ambient? Because I think that's also effectively closed.
I think so too. So yeah. Since we can conclude those.
Yeah. Okay. All right, John, take it away.
Yeah, so this is kind of a carryover from our discussion last week about ingress to waypoint composition. So basically the idea is that we would add a option to allow the ingress to call the waypoint. So what we have today is you can either go through the ingress and apply some routes there and then go directly to the backend, or you can go through the waypoint and apply some routes and go to the backend. These are distinct sets of routes. These are ones that are kind of bound to the service, and these are ones bound to the gateway. This is the exact same way that Sidecar works if you were to place this waypoint on the left. Oh, sorry, I was moving my cursor. I didn't realize I wasn't sharing. But it doesn't matter. It's exactly the same way that it would look if Sidecars was in place of waypoints. Right, like if you want to apply a common policy for all types of traffic, you have to kind of effectively repeat the route in two different places. So why would you want to not do that? Well, if you have some common policy for your service that applies unconditionally, it's kind of annoying to have to configure it twice. It also may be hard from like a ownership model that a service owner that wants to roll out, say like a Canary rollout, has to get permission via usually reference grant and allowed routes and all that sort of stuff to attach their route to the gateway. So you kind of have this low trust service owner that is kind of modifying a highly trusted gateway resource, which is there's a lot of work done to make that possible, but it's also not the easiest thing in the world. Keith mentioned, can't you have multiple target refs to solve this? You kind of can. You can't really like match the host name, like the external host name and the internal host name in the same route. I think actually technically in Gamma, they say you're not allowed to do both in one. But even if we ignore Gamma limitations in virtual service, you could, but it's a little awkward. Even still, I still think there's legitimate reasons why you still may want to do composition, even if the config is the same. Oh, yeah, so I'm talking about routes here. Other policies apply too, kind of, but routes are more prevalent because they're more directly attached. So the idea would be to allow a mode where you can go through ingress and the waypoint, and you apply both routes, right? And not just routes, both sets of policies. And in this case, everything that I have that's anyone calling my service should apply these policies or routes. I stick at the waypoint layer. These would be things like canary rules. Maybe I need to modify some headers, telemetry, whatever. Everything I do there. This is owned by the service owner domain. And now at the ingress layer, all I need to do is do enough work in order to translate the external context. This could be foo.example.com or example.com/foo or something to the internal service. And so that would just be a very simple route that doesn't have to worry about anything like canaries, anything else other than just the bare minimum to get to the service so that we can let the waypoint do its configuration. And you may also want things that are exclusively done for egress, or sorry, not egress, but external traffic. So maybe some rate limiting or authentication or authorization that you apply only at the edge. So these are the two models. We can support both of them. I think that we want to support both of them and have an opt-in to the one on the right. Actually, before I get too far into that, I want to pause for questions to make sure this makes sense of like, what are the two options? And then we can decide what we actually want to do with the options. Yeah, Keith,
Is it
go ahead.
wrong? Is it wrong to think about this about the second option being effectively a superset of the first? Because in theory, you could just have in some extent, in theory, you can have a basic route that doesn't do anything straight to your waypoint. So like, what's the down? I guess another way to phrase my question: what's the downside to the second one? I guess latency, perhaps.
So the reason one, you may not be okay with the latency hit. I think most users, it's probably not a big issue, but for some it is. But the biggest issue is, and why I think we want to make this opt-in, is that there's a big behavioral difference between going through 2 hops and through 1 hop. So if someone has already written policies with this expectation of the split world, like it's fundamentally different to go through 2. So one example when I was playing around with this that I found was I was doing a URL rewrite, and I did that at both the layers because that's how you'd always done it in East2 before, right? And that rule applies on both of them, right? And so I can no longer match on the unwritten rule here because I just rewrote it here. Like you need to be aware that the policies are actually applying multiple times. Like you could have an add header, for example, just a trivial case. It's going to be added twice if you put it on both routes. So you actually need to be cognizant of what the network flow is and write your routes differently depending on whether you're on the left side or the right side, if that makes sense. Another simple example is like fault injection. If I put 50% on both of them, it's going to be 75% chance that it hits. If you canary twice, you're getting wonky percentages, all sorts of things. Like it's not a transparent change for the users is really the key. And I think it's a great model. The right side is like a super nice model that the ingress is really simple routes and then you just have your waypoint. It's just one that a user needs to actually opt into, kind of.
And then just for completeness sake, I guess what's the inverse? Why would we put that extra complexity on the user by having it compose? It needs to be loaded. I just mean like just filling out the question space.
Oh, so why would you do the right side?
No, why would you do the left side?
Oh,
yeah, the right side seems like it's more complexity.
Yeah, you might, I don't know, why would you do left? You want highest performance. You already wrote all your ingress rules, and now you want to, I don't know, go add east-west rules without interfering with that. You're coming from sidecars where it always works like that. Maybe you're, I don't know. I mean, the right side I think is better in many cases. So it's a good question. There's some use cases for sure, but I don't know that it's. I think the majority, 80% of users probably would be well suited with the right side. Certainly new East2 users. I think people that come in with prior expectations are probably more comfortable with the left side because they've dealt with that for quite a while.
Okay, so so maybe getting ahead of you a bit, but you're the anticipation is that it'll be like a one-time pain point for folks who are already using Istio style policies, but we might expect new users to be more cognizant of the network hop. Honestly, that would be the downside of the right side in my mind. And our reason to use the left is that we're just removing complexity from users, but if it was never there to begin with, then I guess it's not that big of a deal. Meaning we're targeting new users.
Yeah, it was an interesting default choice to we made the choice to default to the left, primarily based on performance and the fact that it's closest to what we were currently getting with sidecars. So there was, there's obviously a bias in any API default choice where there's not strong evidence on either side or conclusive evidence on either side for one choice. There's a reasonable discussion to be had about changing the default, or at least giving users a way to choose between these two things at a much more granular level than, service by service.
Yeah, one other thing. sorry, Lynn, if I just still respond to Keith's Slack question. It took a while to think about the answer. The left side as well is much more likely to be how a third-party ingress is going to behave.
So I was just thinking, yeah.
Yeah, there are some that can be configured to do the right side. What they don't know they're doing the right side, but if you stick a Z tunnel in them and they send to the service IP, then they'll be on the right side. If you look at Linkerd's page on this, Linkerd commonly runs a sidecar in front of ingress, so they care about this problem a lot. Whereas we don't really care as much because we have our own ingress. Anyhow, they have a page of like all the different ingresses and how you set them up. There's maybe 10 references on there. 7 of them use an HTTP header to do it, which won't work with ztunnel. 3 of them allow overwriting the service VIP. So for a couple ingresses, you could get the right side with third-party ingress, but for many of them, there's no way to do it. So it is just another factor. And certainly, like any cloud load balancer, obviously we can't stick a Z tunnel in front of them, so they'll be on the left side, unless they natively add support for this, but which is probably not super likely.
Yeah, that definitely summarizes my understanding, because I've looked at this in the past, and yeah, it's basically to get the right side to work, you have to have your ingress be mesh aware somehow, which is either sticking a sidecar next to it or having it in a fully integrated model such that they can be aware of what waypoint it's sending traffic to.
So I was going to weigh in, if you not focus on routes, I mean, routes is one thing. If you focus on policies, like authorization policy, for example, I would definitely think the right side is much closer to sidecars, because I always want my authorization policy to be enforced, and on the left side is like a huge surprise to me, honestly, a lot of times, because for sidecars, I always have something enforced on the server side, unless I'm not in the mesh, right? If my server is not in the mesh, I would expect to be not go through the waypoint, which I think everybody agree. But if I'm in the mesh and I have a waypoint, I would expect the user wants to go through the waypoint most of the time, like Keith was mentioning earlier. Particularly for RC policies, I would want
Right,
to
particularly for L7 authorization policies. The other use case, right, is just failure domain for complex extensions and policies. Right, if a team wants to use a WASM or XDOF or something, right, de-risking putting that in the ingress by putting it in the waypoint and restricting it to that one service or one user is another example of kind of distributing risk and de-risking centralized points of failure.
So essentially, maybe this is an oversimplification, but essentially it's adding another knob. That's the argument that Lou is just essentially making. You're adding another knob for where you can apply these things, so you just have the ability to make that decision in the right side versus the left side.
Right. Yeah. The big decision here is like both are valid. Both have valid use cases. We obviously picked one, the left one, to be the current default. Do we want to change that? Can we change that? Does anybody think that that we don't need both models?
I explicitly think both models are necessary.
Right. Yeah. And even if we didn't have integration requirements or third-party ingresses or anything like that, I still think both models would be necessary, whether it's for performance reasons or cost control reasons.
Yeah.
then so the only other, the remaining question is, which one is the default?
And I think the question that comes out from there also is to make sure it is clear to a user which model is being applied. Because you're going to write policy and write rules differently if you're stacking one after the other than if you're having them independently access the same backend.
Right. So John, like you've seen you've interacted the most with people in Slack who've started trying to get this working. Which of the two models did users default their assumption to?
I would say the right side, but at the same time, I'm more likely to talk to someone that had their assumptions violated than
Right.
someone
Yes.
that
Yes.
did not, so.
That's 100% true. Yeah, I
I
think
would
that's
definitely say it's the right side because every time users asking why my waypoint is bypassed.
well. I think that's partially what that's saying to us, Lynn, is that a lot of people are not doing authorization policy at all. Like I think I've seen it 4 or 5 times in Slack, and I
Did
think
you
there are
say
more.
they are doing RC policy or not?
They're not.
Because I remember one of the users specifically told me he wants to do an external RC policy on his service. Now he can't do that because it didn't go through waypoint.
Right. So I think the point, like John said, is the people who are complaining are the ones who are trying to do authorization policy and having their expectations violated. But more people are not complaining because they haven't yet had their expectations violated. Because
Okay,
they
that's a
just
fair
weren't
point.
trying to do
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
if you're happy, you don't complain. Yeah.
But we just don't know the ratio, right?
I do
So I don't
know
know.
two user wants to, one user in production, the other user wants to be in production. They want to go through waypoint.
Yeah, no, I mean, like we said, both are completely valid. It's, do we want to change the default? Or like, how do we control the scope of the setting?
And this is an
If
open,
we,
yeah.
no, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I was just gonna say this is an open question in Gateway API and Gamma too. Is like there is no clear recommendation for a default behavior or a way to distinguish between them, and there is interest in finding a common answer if we want to suggest anything that we want to see upstream too.
One thing that's interesting for the upstream is that there's no way that the right side can be the default because it's a terrible default if you don't happen to have a service mesh sidecar on
Yep.
your gateway.
Exactly.
And also it doesn't even work for out of cluster implementations practically. So I always see it as an upstream as something that would be an opt-in.
That makes sense to me.
Also, the discussion of where you opt in, like, is it? I have in my PR, it's a service label, which I think makes the most sense for us. But you could also have gateway level ones, route level ones, gateway class level. Like, there's all sorts of options.
Right, namespace level.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think for Istio specifically, I think the left as the default is, I would say, probably makes the most sense because we're staying with the status quo. Changing the defaults at this juncture would probably just create churn in my mind, since what we have today is beta and production ready, and so in my mind there's a fairly high bar for changing anything user impacting, and to the point that was made earlier, like the left side is what most Kubernetes gateways are going to do. Like this is what one would expect if you've been around proxies and stuff in Kubernetes for any given time. So I think left would need to be the default for a multitude of reasons. I don't see how we get past that necessarily, but maybe it's a we can add labels, or there's some enablement mechanism in the future. If it's overwhelmingly the right side, we can talk about changing it, or adding like a feature flag you can do via Helm chart or something like that. But for the time being, I think that we're just kind of stuck with the left side as the default.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
I think I agree too, unless we can be smart about which policy goes through the waypoint, particularly for OSCE.
So John, in terms of scoping, I don't know. Obviously, we have to use waypoint label. I don't know if people are using it more on service or on namespace. I'd probably be a little hesitant to start by offering it on gateway class, right, as the big hammer. We could grow into that one maybe. But namespace versus service seems like doing either of those two would be fine, or both.
I think service makes sense because it's harder to imagine every single service in your namespace you want to connect with the gateway.
It's more that, like, if most users by opting into a waypoint are doing it at the namespace level, and the topology on the right is the one that they want to use by default, then namespace I think would make more sense for them in general.
But I was just saying, typically in a namespace, you don't have all your services connect to the ingress, right? Typically, you only have maybe one or two that's external facing.
But does it matter? Right, that's still like controlled by the routing then.
Okay, it might matter if your client. Do we envision this is only used by ingress? I guess that's the question.
What else could it be used for?
That particular label. Anything else in the mesh? Maybe sidecar or
Yeah,
anything?
John, what did you call the label? Do you want to put it in the chat?
I call it's in if you scroll down slightly, but it's
Oh,
I
sorry.
called it in the PR ingress use waypoint, so it aligns.
Oh,
with
it's particular for ingress. Okay, then never mind. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, so the reason why I think so, Keith, are you suggesting it goes on the gateway? By the way, by your comment there.
Yeah, I might be missing something obvious, but just in my mind, it feels like we're controlling where the gateway routes, and we're telling
Yeah.
them to take an extra hop, as opposed to the reverse, where you're thinking about the services.
Yep. Yeah. So the reason why I think it makes most sense on service, well, namespace and service are basically the same. They're just different ways to control it. If you scroll up a little bit, Louis, back to the diagrams, the reason, well, for one, namespace is hard to implement in Easter-D. We don't need to let that guide us too much, but it was very easy to do service because we already have the service labels everywhere. We'd have to plumb the namespace labels through. Anyhow, but if you look at the routes and the service, all three of those kind of need to be in sync and aware of what each other is doing. And they're typically all owned by the same person. Maybe the ingress route is owned by someone else, but at the very least, they all need to be in sync. And so that's why I felt it should be one of those things that controls it, either at the route level, but that's wonky and doesn't really work. Well, it's weird to do at the route level, which really leaves only the service. So I felt it makes more sense for a service owner to say, look, I built my routes such that I know that ingress is going to call my waypoint. I wrote my policies on my waypoint, and I want those to be enforced. So I'm going to tell the ingress that it needs to go through my waypoint. Versus the gateway saying like, hey, I'm just going to go to everyone's waypoints. I hope it works out. Hopefully you don't, apply a policy twice or something, and we're going to get wonky behavior. I can see an argument, like we can always add a bunch of different, like a huge, tier of hierarchies and whatnot, and you get the gateway, at the service, gateway class, like all namespace, all these different things, and have some merging. But to me, like the most primitive one, if I had to pick one, is kind of the service.
Yeah, I actually tend to agree with that.
Yeah, by the way, for people who manage the gateway, they don't even necessarily know if you have a waypoint or not. right? So
Yeah, they're often not going to be aware of what rules a user has written or expects to be enforced. And yeah, I think the worst case is actually worse than it just duplicates stuff. Like there are implementations that we've seen that do like JWT for in mesh auth Z, and if you have something like that that accidentally gets stuck on a waypoint that's exposed to an ingress and it blocks all traffic because it was expecting to route directly rather than routing through the waypoint, like yeah, I think this is something that the service owner needs to be able to control because they're the ones that are knowing what routes and what policy they're writing.
Okay, so it sounds like we have consensus
Go
to
ahead.
do service then, and then we can look if we want to expand it later.
yeah, the only thing I want to say is as a user, I should be able to label my namespace to say my namespace, I want to use this waypoint. And then on the surface level, I can opt in for ingress to use the waypoint. That should be supported, right? So I don't need to consistency between the two labels on the scope.
Yes, but you can't do. You can never set the ingress one at the namespace level, which I feel like that's an inconsistency that someone will probably hit and be confused, and we should add that. But I would probably do that in a follow-up because it's pretty complicated.
Yeah, we can always add if there's a lot of people asking for that.
Yeah,
Exactly.
for what it's worth, why people, if you're wondering why that's complicated when we already do the namespace label for waypoints, is this is the first time we're really merging the legacy XDS Envoy code to the ambient world. So like Z-tunnels, they have a totally different code path that we configure, and we have easy ability to merge any resources and munch them all together and do whatever the hell we want. The old world is much more structured and limited. And if you look at the PR, you'll see it's pretty hacky how we get things working to some extent. So
I have some reservations about the namespace enablement. Like I get it from an ease perspective, but I like the service owner persona being the one controlling that, but we can talk about that later. My question is actually relevant to what John just said about mixing the legacy with ambient. Or I shouldn't say legacy, mixing the sidecar base generation with ambient. Do we think that for use cases where folks have a Helm chart installed HTTP ingress gateway, not the gateway API, do we expect the ingress use waypoint label to still work for those cases?
I think so, yes. I mean, I think we would also expect like users of virtual service to work.
Oh, I think virtual service, because I remember that in the ambient only chart, didn't you have to decide to not support virtual service for ambient?
So technically, virtual service works 100% fine for ambient. It's more of a question of whether and how much we want to artificially limit it. So today we just don't document it and say that it's not part of beta or GA. If we want to go further than that in the future, we could do so. But it's largely irrelevant internally because we convert HTTP routes to virtual services anyways. So
Okay, fair.
Yeah.
Okay. So what about like the so in theory the ingress use waypoint label which could still work from a Helm chart installed gateway.
yeah, I mean, this has nothing to do with how the gateway is installed. Really, you could do a gateway however you want. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah. I didn't actually fully grok your question at the beginning. Yes, absolutely. It's any gateway.
All right. Awesome.
Okay. On the doc, I put some decisions that it seemed like we had consensus on. If you agree or disagree, feel free to indicate on there. Seems like we're kind of wrapping up here. Is there any other topics people want to bring up?
I have a quick question around, since we've got a lot of folks here, on how we're feeling towards the Ambient GA timeline. We've got owners for most of the issues in the board, which is great. If we have issues for things like the competition, let's make sure we add it to the board. But do we feel, how confident are we with our 124 GA date as of now? With quick math here, 5 weeks before the release, maybe more. Or cut, I guess, for branch cut, maybe.
Yeah, 2 months before the 2 months before the release. Yeah, maybe 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Cut. But the good thing is, I think a lot of our work item can be done post the branch cut, right? A lot of them are dog performance test, you know, automated testing. John.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in general, I think we're making good progress. But one thing I did want to bring up was on the ambient only mode. We had some discussion. Well, one, we marked that as a must-have. We had some discussion on Slack or maybe the GitHub PR that maybe this actually wasn't worth doing. So I wanted to see if we want to remove that from the must-haves. So the argument made was that I put up a PR to add it. And there's really not that much today that we can meaningfully do to make the ambient only mode. Like we had disabling the mutating webhook, which is already an option that's exposed in Helm. It's just one flag that someone can set. And then we had removing CRDs. And the interesting thing was that everyone, like I think literally everyone, had a different view of what set of CRDs should be excluded. There's a lot of combinations. So I think there was enough that everyone had a distinct mindset. Mine was, you shouldn't have sidecars on with filters, gateways, and virtual services. I think maybe Keith or someone said, hey, there should be virtual services and maybe gateways, I forget. And someone else said, oh, there should be envoy filter. I don't think anyone sidecar, but everything else was kind of in contention. And it made me really wonder, like, is there really value to this profile? Like, the original goal, in my understanding from Mitch primarily, was that you have a way to run without the increased privileges required to run a webhook. You can already do that. It's a one flag away. We've already merged in the ability to selectively disable some CRDs. We didn't have that before, so that was a good thing that came out of it. I'm just not so sure there's a need to have that like opinionated ambient only mode, and didn't really feel compelled to bike shed over what exactly is in it. Yeah.
I'll put it this way. I don't know if we'll know the usefulness, or I don't know that we'll know exactly what needs to be in that chart until post GA. Like I don't know if we're going to do something like that. I don't know that now is the time. I think there needs to be enough soak time for folks to really get using it, to put it in their CI/CD pipelines, to run into issues, and then we'll know exactly like what's the minimum viable footprint.
Well, we have some time to bike shed, so we could try and bike shed. And if we can't reach some consensus in a budgeted amount of time, then we can abandon the effort. I think that's fair. Obviously it's a perceptual thing, right? It's not, like you said, John, it's not really a technical thing. Like it's clearly a perceptual thing. So let's ignore the implementation detail requirements for a second. Obviously the permission stuff is important, but there are ways to do it. So which were the API, like maybe you should I'll just put them in the notes up and down. Which were the APIs? Okay. So let's do this in negative. Somebody has to make a case to keep the sidecar API.
No one wants to keep it. So that one was easy.
That's easy. Okay. Okay, who wants to keep Envoy filter in by default? Assuming you can add it after the fact.
Sorry, you can find settings on your device using the settings.
I'll steelman this position and say that if you want to use like John said, for ingress, anything to do with rate limiting or stateful sessions, cookies, etc., you need Envoy filter.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, probably no maintainer wants it because it's a pain in the ass to maintain. But the users, they all want it, right? So not all, but a lot of them do.
Gotcha.
Just a quick question. With regards to decision for which CRDs to keep or remove, just curious, is it based on migration-related considerations, or this is purely based on a net new greenfield deployment of Istio Service Mesh?
It could be migrations, but only after they've completed. What we're talking about is we already have a mode that enables ambient, but what we have been discussing is whether we should have a mode where you only have ambient and no sidecar support. So definitely for anyone that still has sidecars, it wouldn't be appropriate, but it could be after they've migrated. It's not necessarily only a new user.
Got it. Thanks.
Do we have a working doc somewhere of basically burning down the Envoy filter required use cases? So like I know rate limiting is the common obvious one, but I think you had mentioned before in the issue somewhere, John, that like that's only like 10% of the reasons that like people are commonly using Envoy filter. Like if we can find what those are and work towards like a path to get those supported in ambient through other means, is that useful work?
I think it's useful work, but it doesn't actually get to the end state of Envoy filter removed because, like Keith said, Quat has a doc. I don't know if he's able to share it, but I've at least seen it. And there is a chunk of big things like rate limiting and some other common use cases, but there's a long tail of I want to set this random Envoy field that like I haven't even heard of, and there's 100 different unique ones, so that they kind of never go away really. And those are even things that would be like hard to like put in an API. So
yeah, things that don't make sense to expose to most users or
Yeah, I wanted to express similar sentiment and to add that it's helpful on when you're debugging something at the customer and you just need to change something and see if it works. Even if we later fix it in Istio or introduce an API for it, it's nice to have that break glass for debugging. That said, I also don't want to see it widespread used by users because it is a pain in the ass.
Yeah, even just like last week, there was some ambient user that had an issue, and I just gave them an Envoy filter to test out the change that I proposed would fix it, and they deployed it to prod, and they would not have deployed my custom-built Istio to prod. Maybe they shouldn't have deployed my Envoy filter either, but
that sounds like
they're willing
in features that don't exist yet. Yeah, that's another. I mean, it's more of a developer experience case than end user, hopefully, but yeah, that makes sense.
All right, so we're all saying Envoy filter is the drug you cannot quit.
Yeah.
I will say I think it might be useful to maybe to put the feedback you just had into a couple of buckets. So I think a lot of the last conversation was around Envoy filter sticking around in Istio. Does it need to be in the ambient only profile? I think there are other reasons for yes, such as rate limiting. But I think that's maybe distinct from a couple of the other pieces of feedback we were talking about.
Yeah, it's kind of like the safe mode 2.0 with a different name, right? And it has the exact same issue that it has with safe mode, is that everyone has their own view of what safe mode is. And so, like in my mind, I had the same answer back then as I do now. Like Istio shouldn't define a safe mode. We should provide options for users to tune to make things how they want, and maybe provide some guidelines. But everyone's going to have a different view of what that is. So.
I mean, my personal opinion that we don't have to install it by default, but if we'll be able to when we need it. 'Cause I think a lot of users will not need it. Once we cover the common use cases.
I'm fine with installing it by default. It would be nice to see status on it, I guess. But I'm also okay with not installing it by default. And just telling users they can manually install it. And just changing the docs for envoy filter. But I'd rather not make people jump through hoops if the docs already tell people that envoy filter is a dangerous thing to be using, which they kind of do. So I would lean towards just installing it.
Yeah. There's also another argument to be made that maybe we should default to it not being installed in all cases. And then you have to opt in, maybe with a flag that says, I like very scary envoy filters and YOLO in production or whatever. I don't know. Sure, we can come up with a scarier name, but that's probably outside of scope for this ambient discussion.
Well, even for the ambient discussion, I think putting my steering committee hat on, it feels really rough from a product perspective to have docs that tell you to use an envoy filter to get certain functionality, and then it not be there by default. I don't know. That feels sort of, and there's no other way to get the functionality. So yeah, or break glass API, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that should really have like, well, yeah, okay, yeah. Should we go on to the gateway and probably virtual service? Well, let's do gateway first. It's somewhat different than virtual service, I suppose.
Right, and here we mean the Istio gateway.
Yeah.
Not the
Classic.
Kubernetes. Classic. Can anybody, like, most of what Istio Gateway does is covered by Gateway. I'm trying to think, like, auto SNI routing is the only really differentiated feature, right?
Yeah, you can configure that with the gateway too.
Yeah.
I think that I don't know if there's really anything other than really niche things. Like in gateway, you can bind to a specific IP or even a UDS socket, like really niche stuff like that.
But even that, like we have discussed how to do that with, like,
yeah, so like that stuff, but like it's not like virtual service where there's actually a relatively large feature gap. The problem is that you can't use the Kubernetes gateway with virtual service in a supported way. If you're Costin, I think you could figure it out, but no one else, and it's not documented or supported or anything. So that's really where the gap is.
Okay, does somebody want to make a case to keep Classic Gateway for this profile?
As long
I
as the
think
profile is named ambient only instead of ambient, then I'm good.
Yeah, I mean the case to keep it, I think, is that one, how you deploy your gateway technically is unrelated to ambient. So we're kind of making this not the ambient only mode, but really the things I like mode, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you know, it is what we're doing. And like I may already have a big Ingress gateway with thousands of routes and whatnot, and maybe using these two features, in particular the virtual service ones. But I want to migrate to ambient. Now, why do I have to go move that all over to the gateway API? And technically you don't. You cannot use the ambient only profile. But even without this whole profile business, a lot of people have thought that thought process. They thought they had to move to the gateway API to using ambient, even for like their gateways and whatnot, which is not really true. I don't hate the perception of that so much because we want users to do it anyways, and it kind of gives them a push to do it. But it's also a dangerous game because it could also just push people to not adopt ambient.
So is the ambient only profile target for the net new user, or are we also target for existing user? I think that's the question too.
Well, that's also part of my problem with it is I don't know who the user is. The only explicit use case we got was that you want to deploy ambient with lower permissions.
Right, which is from Mitch mentioned, yeah.
Ironically, none of these CRDs have anything to do with permissions.
Right, the permission one is a different one. That's turning off the webhook, which
Right, it's a webhook.
that part's
Yeah.
at least not controversial. So like that was always known to be part of the ambient mode. Right.
I think we have to say like it is for net new users, right? Like maybe ambient only is the wrong term to use. Ambient recommended doesn't quite have the right connotation, right?
Yeah, because we already
we need
have
is
an
V2.
ambient profile, so we have to differentiate between the two profile, right? The ambient profile supports sidecar and everything listed on the screen. So if the ambient only is for net new user, yeah.
Maybe a crazy idea. What if we didn't call this the ambient only profile and we just called it the modern profile or something? And then it really is bleeding edge. What this group of people thinks at a given release, what are the best options? And we don't necessarily have compatibility on it. We can change what are our recommendations.
I think that's my issue with this. Like at that point, this really is a V2. Like the modern or V2 new gen Istio, and the audience for that, it feels like it's this room. Like can we make a compelling case for a large enough segment of our user base that would benefit from that, as opposed to just what this group wants people to use?
Well, there's the net new user argument, right, Keith? Right, like ambient is very, in particular, targeted at like broadening the reach to people who just want MTLS, right, to start with. And the market analysis is that there's a decent segment of those people who want that. Now we might be dancing on the head of the pin.
Yeah, do we want to restrict those users though? Like ultimately, this is not about, because the answer to that group is sort of what John is saying. It's like to document a clear path. What we install is not so much of an issue. This is quote unquote extended or advanced functionality that they may use if they want to get ahead of Gateway API, for example. It's like already there. The decision we're making now for ambient only is it's not arbitrary, but to generally restrict what they're able to do with their default install. And I think that's a slightly different argument in my mind.
So I think it's worth considering the cognitive load for a new user. I don't know if we want even on the kget gateway, people get the wrong gateway, that'd be annoying. You know what I mean? Like, I think when you interact with a new user that doesn't know or doesn't care about all Istio features and all he wants is MTLS, I would opt for the least amount of stuff just to reduce the learning curve.
Like ambient minimum.
Right? Because for me, sometimes it happens. I do kget gateway and I get the wrong gateway.
Yeah, that is confusing.
Jackie has a hand for a while.
Yeah, I guess I want to make sure that we're solving a problem for the users we're expecting to solve it for. Like, if this is for new ambient users, are we trying to just prevent them from, deploying or adding resources that they're not going to understand or are going to have unintended effects? Like, what are we really trying to simplify by removing these resources? Or is it just that we need more documentation for new users that are going to be adopting ambient, that okay, hey, you don't really need to pay attention to these resources to accomplish these initial tasks, but we could still have them there. I think I just want to make sure we're removing these really is solving it for the intended group that we're looking to solve this problem for. So I would agree. Maybe we just need more documentation for new users.
My personal experience that people, well, maybe it's just our customers, don't really bother with reading docs.
Right.
Fair.
Yeah,
No,
like the
that's true. That's everyone.
Yeah, like the footgun problem is real. Like I think we've seen over the years, people like operators have installed Istio, and then some team in some namespace starts doing something using an API, and all hell breaks loose. Like they start using Envoy filter, and then the operator's like, "What the hell?" And they don't have strict admission control or anything like that. And so it really is trying to give people a kind of presumptive safety net without them having to engage with the docs like that.
Will they know to use the ambient only profile to start with then? Like, is that descriptive enough for that user if they're not reading the documentation?
They do at least read the install documentation because they do the install.
Fair.
Like that much we can guarantee that they've done if they install the thing, right? It's the one piece of documentation engagement we can guarantee some degree of user interaction with. Not to say that we've necessarily done a great job with that in the past, but overall, I would say that I don't know if we actually have like page view stats on Istio.io, but I suspect the install and kind of demo scripts get more traction than, let's say, the Envoy filter documentation page does, or the security caveats page, for instance, being another great example, a recent example of a customer not reading or understanding the docs and having an issue.
We do have analytics, by the way.
Yeah, I thought we did.
Craig
I
has
just
some data.
no
You do,
idea.
and I no longer have permission after leaving Google.
Sweet.
Well, you might though. Here, I'll put the link in if anyone wants to look. They might have data permission. Probably at least Lynn does, I would guess.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah, I don't have permission.
You
But
don't.
but I kind of wondering, should we kind of defer this until after GA when we have more data points?
I guess the only question then is like, is GA like a watershed moment in terms of adoption, and avoiding the foot gun is valuable in that particular time slot? I don't have a super strong opinion on that, Lynn, but
My concern is sort of the opposite, actually, is that if we announce an ambient only profile during GA, that lends more weight to the profile and doesn't allow us to iterate as well as we otherwise might. That makes sense?
I'm not sure I totally grok that, Keith.
So in my mind, I'm thinking if we, as part of GA, here's this ambient minimal, ambient recommended, ambient tiny profile that you're using, that we make available to use. My worry would be that users put a lot more stock in that profile, and we as a community become less incentivized to make changes to it, even if there might need to be changes made to it, because it is seen as more solid or GA. Because really the status of any profile that we make, even if we put it, if we release it during GA, the status of that is really going to be alpha. Like it's brand new. It's going to be there for the first time. But coupling that with the GA announcement make the profile seem a lot more hardened than it actually is. And I think with this, I think we want to reserve the right to make changes to what's in the profile versus not, and do so fairly freely.
So yeah, like what does it mean to GA a profile? Like we don't have any criteria for that.
Correct. I'm talking about user perception.
Right.
So GA ambient, here's the ambient only profile. As a user, how stable do I think that profile is?
Versus the ambient profile, right, which is the more forgiving one.
Right.
It's the upgrade friendly one, right? Like these are all nomenclature problems. Like we could say like the existing ambient one is like the ambient transitional one, right? It's designed to help you migrate an existing install.
Yeah, the only problem though is we don't support Cyca ambient interrupt to GA, so it's a little bit confusing.
But we would keep the profile stable for that definition as we added features to cover that use case.
Agreed. Yeah. So basically, the profile doesn't mean everything else is on the same feature level, right?
Yeah, the profile doesn't say anything about the individual features. It's really just saying about what's the recommended things for your use case.
It's an opinion. Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that, I don't think. Like, it's not going to save us any deprecation effort. Like, we'll have users who will install the Ambient transitional profile, but only ever use the Ambient features, and then have installed the sidecar CRD. And let's say, for some reason or other, let's say we deprecate the sidecar CR in favor of either some different API or something else happens. What with that? I don't think we really saved any effort. So it's just the foot gun thing.
Yeah. So the
Right,
question
we
is,
wouldn't necessarily
sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Ellen. You go ahead.
No, I was just trying to get back to my question early. Do we need to decide it right now, or can we wait until after GA when we have a little bit more data point? Because like John was saying earlier, everything we're discussing is possible to be configured today with our installer.
Is that true for everything or just webhook?
Can we do customer resources too? I thought John said.
You couldn't until recently, but I broke that part out of the ambient profile thing, and I'm pretty sure it got merged. So that's just a generally useful thing. I've wanted to add that. Yeah, that got merged.
So then
we've had
someone
users who do that for years.
Anyone can create their own safe profiles with that, pretty much, and exclude whatever the hell they want. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so the alternative is just to create some doc to say, look, if you want to maximally future-proof yourself and prevent foot guns,
Right.
do this.
Which Ian suggested 30 minutes ago. So.
Okay, so it sounds like we're saying we're not going to do an ambient only profile in the medium term.
But we should do some doc to do what we've mostly agreed in the bike shedding.
Is it?
I think it could even be. Go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say, is it safe to go ahead and turn off the sidecar CRDs for the current Envoy profile, since we don't support back compat there anyway, and that seems the only non-controversial one? Could we just turn that off and leave the others?
But for the ambient profile, you mean?
Yeah, the current ambient profile that we have.
Ambient profile today means ambient plus sidecars. So
yeah.
Okay.
That's the gotcha.
Yeah, I don't think we can do that then.
Also, we would disable the webhook too.
Yeah, I think generally having, now that we can selectively remove CRDs, I think it'd be useful to have a page on that in the operations section, speaking directly to mesh admins and say, hey, here are the things to keep in mind when it comes to your install of Istio, and essentially have if you want to be opinionated, have basically take John's blog about CRD in Istio and sort of give recommendations to mesh admins now that functionality exists and we're templating.
Yeah, that sounds good. Should we track this? Actually, maybe we have an existing issue.
Yeah,
which we need to track it to a doc.
I'm gonna modify it.
And then we can revisit after the GA. All right, I think we have consensus. I don't think everybody knows we're trying to do thumbs up in the meeting notes so we can record who are okay with the decision. All right, should we give people time back? Actually, 3 minutes over. Should we end the call?
No time back. Negative time back.
All right, thanks everybody. Great discussion. Bye.
Take care, y'all.
Everyone.